It's about to go down. I'm very excited about this. Megan Red Shirt Shaw is an aspiring educator, writer, and researcher in higher education, passionate about Indigenous rights issues, college admissions, and greater Native presence in media and higher education. Megan believes in empowering young people to use their voices for the issues they care about in their communities. A powerful speaker. She has presented at colleges and universities as well as conferences nationwide. Her favorite phrase her mother ever taught her in Lakota, and I had to ask her how to say this, is Weksuye, Chiksuye, Mixuye, which means I remember you, remember me. Please give a warm welcome to Miss Megan Red Shirt Shaw.
Daniel, thank you so much. And I am very excited to be here. And that was one of the best groundings of a morning program that I've ever seen. So I appreciate you, and I will remember. So thank you so much. I am very honored to be here. I'm very excited to be here, and just really looking forward to being in community with each other. It sounds like you had a wonderful day yesterday and are moving into wonderful programming today. And so thank you to all of you for the work that you do in your communities, and the students that you care for, and the institutions that you build and grow and are a part of. And I am very excited to be with all of you. So today I am going to be presenting, and sort of the concept around what I'm hoping to share a little bit about is we are still here, relations, foundations, and Native nations. And so we'll talk about some of these words, these concepts, these ideas, and really hoping that some of these ideas will sort of ground you in the work that you do, remind you of things that are familiar to you in the work that you do, and just have a really good session together this morning. So thank you again for being here. It's really important for me to thank these incredible organizations that put this together, the people that put this together, the invitation to speak. I just really want to say Pilame na Wopila to all of these incredible places that organized all of this for you today. I know that there's so much that goes into this and so much planning and organization. And so I just wanted to take a moment just to say thank you. Thank you for sharing this space. Thank you so much for putting this together and for bringing this incredible group of people together as well. So, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge the land, and that is absolutely something that I'll be talking about today with all of you. I am very, very grateful today to be home with my family. I know that for so many of us, we waited a long time to see our family members through this last very difficult year. I was telling Daniel before this got started that I waited 477 days to see my parents and my siblings. So I'm not actually in South Dakota right at this moment. I am located in the Bay Area. So I am on someone else's traditional homelands of the Mwakma Ohlone people. And all of you in your work, just sharing and really thinking about whose traditional homelands you currently are seated upon, and the sacrifices that those Native nations made for the betterment of our spaces and institutions to exist, I think is really important. I often talk a lot about land acknowledgements. I'm going to talk about them more a little bit today, but the importance of partnering with tribal nations and discussing how we write land acknowledgements or how we craft land acknowledgements is really, really critical and really crucial. I know so many amazing organizations have crafted them and put them on their signatures or do them at the beginning of conferences or events, but it's really so important to include Native voices in that decision-making process and sort of think about that relationship to land, which is absolutely something that I'm excited for us to think about more today. So it's important for me to first introduce myself in Lakota. So Michajiki Megan Red Shirt Shaw Kol Michajiki Chankoshtanwi was Yahanaha Himataha Malakota. And it is also important for me in our language, in the Lakota language, and I'm very lucky to have my mother, who's a first language speaker. She talks so much about relations and relationships and the way that we identify ourselves with other people. For me, my identifiers are that I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm an aunt, and I'm a partner. And so within our language, right, those would be very, very important relational concepts that we would share with one another. So it's very, very important when I introduce myself that I position myself as, these are my relations. This is the way that I identify with other people. I'm also an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe, which is located in South Dakota, where I live. And it was very important for me to return to South Dakota and my work. My partner, my husband is from there. My mother is from there. And I knew that in wanting to sort of give back and be a part of community, that it was really important for me to return to my traditional homelands. In that regard, I'm Director of Native Student Services at the University of South Dakota, brand new in October. Learned a tremendous amount over the last 7 months of doing that role. And I am also a PhD student in Organizational Leadership, Policy, and Development with an American Indian Studies minor at the University of Minnesota. That turned during the pandemic, like so much of our work and so many of our roles. But really sort of my foundation is in admissions and college counseling and student success. And another sort of relatable fact, I hope, to some of you is that I'm a diehard earring collector. I often joke with people that I'll have to do a pull out somewhere in my closet for the earrings that I have. And I'm also a cat mom, so a very, very passionate cat mom. So those are some of the things that make me who I am. I think it's also really important as we talk about this work for me to acknowledge that my entire life has been grounded in higher education. I grew up in admissions and teaching and higher ed. Really, both my parents work in higher education, my father and my mother, and I now work within the system. I am trying to study the system. I have been immersed in it my entire life, really this concept of how do we get to college? And really the work that I do now is informed by those experiences of my parents created a picture and painted a picture for me that higher education was possible for me. And I understand and acknowledge that privilege because so many of the students that I work with in my day-to-day did not have the same experiences as me. I grew up going to university powwows and seeing Native students as a normal part of my experience. And then actually in going to college, it was shocking to me when I realized that there were so few other students who shared that with me, shared being an Indigenous person with me. So again, I think it's critically important when we're visiting with each other and thinking about it, right? What lenses do we have easy access to? What are the things that we're able to put on and take off within our own ways that we view the world and see the world, epistemologies, the way that we're raised, the things that we think about, what are those informed by? And so before I sort of launch into talking about the things that I really think about with regards to these concepts of foundations, relations, education, Native nations, right? It's important for me to frame that I grew up thinking that college was a possibility for me, knowing that college was a possibility for me. And that's very different than the day-to-day experiences of many of the students that I have the opportunity to work with. I think it's also really important for us to acknowledge, that we are grieving in so many ways, that the COVID-19 global pandemic, racial injustices, the political divide, the loss of emotional, spiritual, and human connection, and really the extraction and destruction of land in this country and across the world. I think it's really important, much in the way that Daniel had us do the breathing exercises this morning, that we take a moment to just sit with ourselves and acknowledge that grief and the loss and the grappling that so many of us have had to do over this last year. So we'll just take a moment together. In your work this past year, what did your other duties as assigned include? I think that so often in the culture of working in education, especially with students, we constantly have to be asking ourselves the question of, right, checking in with ourselves. How are you doing? Did you forgive yourself for that thing you forgot, that thing you didn't do for a student or for work or for the institution that you serve, or that presentation that you gave, right? The thing that you didn't say. Have you really been hard on yourself this past year for feeling like you did not do the work to the best of your ability? And have you forgiven yourself for that? This is one of the absolute hardest years that many of us will ever experience in our lifetime, and working in education and working in these systems. Have you really practiced forgiveness and been gentle with yourself and your spirit over this last year? It's critically important for us to really ground ourselves in having that conversation and connecting and reconnecting with our bodies, right? To say, I forgive you. I forgive you for the things that you didn't get done this year. And I really pulled these concepts, right, from what you're a part of this week. You don't have to know all of the answers. This is taken directly from the programming that you're doing this week, the Virtual Institute. Mistakes are expected and accepted. Your curiosity and desire to grow are valued. Uncomfortable conversations support relationship and growth. Grace is extended and reciprocated, and repair is part of the process. This is Epoch Education wrote this for you this week, right? And so in working through that forgiveness, even in a virtual space, even as you come together with your cohorts and are in conversation with each other, right? Really navigating that this year, this was the ultimate year of not having the answers, right? And really sort of how do we move forward as a collective? How do we heal? How do we forgive ourselves and move past, right, the things that we didn't get done? This is something that I really hope that you're able to ground in the work that you do this week. A little bit of my own sort of reflections, right, of the past year. My office, so being the Director of Native Student Services, means that my office is located in the Native American Cultural Center on our campus at the University of South Dakota. And I started at the end of October, so middle of the semester, mid-pandemic almost, really having to learn a role and also undo so much of the things that I thought about student services, right? And about serving students who didn't always have the answers, and acknowledging and understanding that I didn't always have the answers, right? And really actually showing that vulnerability to students. I ordered this banner off of Etsy halfway through my time and really wanted students to feel like my office and the cultural center was a space where they could come and be vulnerable and be themselves and sit in complete silence, right? And not even totally know what their emotions were or what was on their mind, right? But even just to be comfortable in that discomfort. And really challenging for me, higher education, to be better and kinder and more reflective of who we are within all of our education systems, right? This year ultimately challenged us so much. USD was very unique in the pandemic in that we were entirely in person for the entirety of the year. There was not, at the end of the spring semester last year, the institution went virtual and then they returned in the fall with students. And so navigating that with students too, right? Experiences that they saw of friends who were entirely virtual and this hybrid model and navigating that, what that looked like. For me, it was about listening. I had to center listening more than I ever had in my entire life before. And again, this idea of growth, right? And acceptance of the mistakes that we made. That was something that was really, really critical for me as I reflected on that. And it really, really spoke to, right, what we learn about ourselves through the processes that we're a part of, what you'll learn about yourself this week, what you will learn about yourself in the next 30 minutes or later on today or next week. Something may come to you, right? This idea of listening and being reflective in our practices. So I present a question to you after doing all of this sort of grounding and really thinking about like, what happened this past year and what has happened in our lifetimes and what we are really sort of motivated by or what we know. And I think it's really important for me to ask the question of what do you know? What do you know about Indigenous people? What do you know about Native nations? What did your history books teach you? What were the conversations that you had about Native people when you were growing up? Was it that they no longer existed? Was it that it was one page in your history textbook? Were you surrounded by Indigenous people? Was that a normal part of your growing up? What is it ultimately that you learned when you were small, when you were thinking about history and how the United States was formed and Indigenous people across the world and those relationships, right? Ultimately, you as an individual person being reflective in this moment, what do I know about Indigenous people? I often ask when I work a ton, as I mentioned before, in undergraduate admissions, and I do trainings with undergraduate admissions offices about Native people. And it's incredibly hard to cover who Native people are in 1 hour, right? Or 45 minutes or 30 minutes. And so a lot of times I will ask, depending on where that office is located, if you can name 10 towns in your state, but you can't name 10 sovereign nations in the United States, what does that mean? And why is that, right? As you think across the world, if you can name 10 cities, but you can't name 10 indigenous nations that are located here, why? And why has that happened? And what systems were created that held you down from having that knowledge? And now, as a person who has agency and thought and consideration, right, about the things that you don't know in your life, why is it that you haven't continued that growth for yourself, right? To say, I don't actually know anything about the tribes that are located here in my state, right? Or right down the street from me. And again, today, very hard for me to cover, right? There are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States, hundreds more that are not recognized by states or federal processes, others that are only recognized by states, right? These dynamics are very, very complicated. And the way that each of those places determines who's a member, who isn't, those things are very, very complicated. So today I don't have time, right, to cover this diaspora of complex, rich Native people, other than to say, right, a lot of times Native people are grouped together. These are our Native students, so we're going to put them all in a room together and they're going to understand each other's experiences. Our communities are so diverse. Some of our communities are traditional enemies with each other, right? The complexity of Native people, right? I can't put it into a presentation. And I can only represent myself as one half Lakota, half white person, right? That is my experience, who grew up in higher education, who has a very different lens on the world than other Native people, right? Today, really grounding yourself in this understanding of like, what do I know? What have I learned? What did school teach me when I was going through the learning process myself? And as I continue through the learning process, what does that look like for me? And so the second question that's really connected to this, right, is what is your relationship to land? And it doesn't have to be, right, I've asked this question before and I've had responses like, I don't have a connection, right? Or it's my traditional homelands. It's the plants, it's the medicines, it's the birds outside, right? So these sort of varying levels of land. But for you as an individual, when you think about the word land, the concept of land, what is your relationship to it? And the reason that I ask that is because Indigenous people and Native nations, their relationship to land is incredibly strong, and it always has been. I want you to take a moment and watch this graphic go by. If you look at what this represents, if you think about what this represents, to me, you can look at the graph and it will tell you that this is really acquisition of land, land that formerly was considered to be indigenous land is the blue. And the red is ultimately where we were moved onto federal reservations as Native people, access to that land. I asked you what your relationship to land was because this is part of my relationship to land, is loss of it. And for me, in working with young people, it is lost to the knowledge that this land has for our students and for our nations. And so I really, for each of you, the place that you're from, the places you love to travel to, right? At one point, every single space in this country belonged to Native people, right? In one way or another. And so I say that because for Native nations, we really think about relationships as something that is connected to our grounding of space, right? We think about systems as relatives. So these kinship systems of living things, right? Living spaces. The earth is alive. We don't talk about that enough. A lot of times we're having these workshops or sessions where you go out into nature and you really appreciate it, or you take a photograph and you show all of your friends, right? This is the space, this is the land that I visited today. But even on your walk across the school or the institution that you work for, right? How often are you actually stopping and thinking, what kind of a tree is that? What is that bird that I'm hearing, right? We equate all bird sounds to be the same, but really, like, what is that bird saying? Who are they talking to, right? And this idea that land is also a relative, it's a relation. We should care for it. I recently read this really beautiful concept of writing a land acknowledgement, right? And even actually going out and putting your hand into the soil when you're writing that land acknowledgement. Like, do we actually think about the relationship that we have? A land acknowledgement isn't a checkbox, right? We did that, so now we can move forward. We did that for Indigenous people, right? It's about more than that. It's the relationship that we have. What is the relation that the institution that you work for actually has to land? Has it been extractive? Have there been ways that it's been exploitative, right? And so that space that we occupy is important because it was always important to us. And you saw it within that map, right? The removal of Indigenous people from their homelands. That was centered in our knowledge system, where the stars were located, the directions that we faced, the way that we moved as people who traveled, right? Depending on seasons or space or need for access to food systems. And so the privileges that we occupy within those spaces are important because of the way that society is constructed, right? We live in a colonial society. We live in a space that has tried to completely erase or eradicate, right, the existence of Native people or Indigenous knowledge systems, despite the fact that we are older than time immemorial, right? So this concept of relations and how we are good relatives to each other is critically important. One of my favorite things to talk about with students is that, and so many of you I know have experienced this in different ways in your work and in your life. Sometimes you will read something, it will be a book or a poem or a concept, and it will totally blow you away. And for me, it was this report written by Robert Lee and Tristan Atone. And it's in High Country News, and it is called Land Grab Universities. You can actually go to their website, which is landgrabu.org, and see all of the reports that extended from this, all of the things that were written after these reports were released. But essentially, it has been a data collection of institutions across the United States that benefited from expropriated Indigenous land. So this concept of the land grant system, education for all, right? Educating all people. This for me was foundational. This for me started to make me say to myself, what is the relationship that Native people and land and institutions have with each other? I felt like finally somebody out there in the world had seen me, right? And I've had wonderful conversations with Tristan and many, many other scholars. I really encourage you to go and take a look at landgrabu.org. Scroll all the way down, you will see many, many different pieces that were written about this issue. You will see the report that they conducted. It really, truly is incredible. And for me, it was, I think I would almost even err on the side of life-changing. And it extended into my own concept of we are still here, right? Native people are still here. We still have agency, and we still should be able to express how we feel about the systems that have been created that have prevented our students from being successful. So I was given an opportunity through a wonderful organization called Accept in undergraduate admissions, as well as the RISE Center at CU and at Colorado State, I apologize, and was given the opportunity to write a policy brief. And really the encouragement that I had was dream big, or go home. Like, what would you put out into the universe if you really, really wanted something to happen on behalf of the students that you work with? And so I really had to dig deep into this idea of, okay, in so many of our institutions, right, this we are still here often comes in the form of a land acknowledgement. But a land acknowledgement has to be for any institution step zero, right? It is about relationship and relational responsibility that institutions have to Native nations. So I asked myself the question, truly, what is a land acknowledgement without land? And what is Indigenous knowledge without what we learn from that land? And so really this contention for higher education, right, is that American systems, they really are morally obligated to acknowledge the educational needs of Indigenous people and to face their ongoing system of power that perpetuates the repression and erasure of Indigenous nations and their knowledge systems as well, right? That was something that was critically important for me to explore, for me to think about. And so I wrote a policy brief really centered on that. And the idea, apologize, I've lost my mouse, was beyond the land acknowledgement, college land back or free tuition for Native students. And so I challenged higher education institutions by writing this to say, either you need to return institutional land back to Native nations, or if that institutional land cannot be returned, providing free higher education to Native students on their traditional homelands as land-based reparations. As I said before, right, concepts of activism, this idea of land back, what does that look like for Native people? For me, it was really reflecting on our systems suffer if we don't have access to land. There is so much that we can teach our students if we bring them back to their traditional homelands and show them the ways that their relatives were always ultimately successful. And for so many systems of higher education, especially, even within our school systems, right, K-12, what access to knowledge has been lost for Native people and Native nations by the creation of Western systems of thought, right? Really sort of thinking about this from the lens of higher education can be better. And so this was a really great experience for me in writing it and receiving feedback on it and working with really amazing people, and have actually had feedback from institutions who have used this policy brief in opportunities that they have really put forward to their institutions, to their leadership and institutions, to say, hey, here's another idea, right? Why don't we talk about this and what this could possibly look like? That Native students could have an opportunity to attend college for a more affordable cost, or for with entire need met for them, right? So these were some of the things that I was really sort of thinking about with those relationships. And so this idea that American colleges and universities, because of these foundations, really are morally obligated to acknowledge these educational needs and to face the ongoing systems that perpetuate the repression and erasure of Indigenous people and their knowledge systems. If you think about even research that's conducted that has to do with land specifically, the extractive nature of that, right? And not consulting with communities that have known and understood this land for an incredible amount of time. I have worked at different institutions and across different organizations. And so often, I think that science and Indigenous people are not given an opportunity to really be hand in hand with each other and to respect the idea that Indigenous systems of knowledge, again, we're science-based and we're astrology-based and we're truth-based, and they supported entire systems and entire networks of people for thousands and thousands of years prior. And so for me, it always centers back to students, right? Again, those concepts and those ideas of like, what access has student lost? And now I have this new sort of concept of my own identity of we're still here, right? These things still matter. What profit have our institutions really benefited from in having that access to land and that access to knowledge as well? And really, ultimately, this idea of like beyond the land acknowledgement. And there are a ton of Native people. I also really encourage you to look up work regarding land acknowledgements and relationship to land. Because again, being very tribally specific, being in conversation with different Native people about the way that they view land, the way that they have relationships with animals, trees, plants, stars, right? All of those things are going to be different based on what our cultural identity is. But this idea that if we do a land acknowledgement, but we're not actually thinking about or centering land in the work that we do, then what power do those words hold for students without action? And for so many of the students that we work with, right, they come from systems that have often made them promises that have fallen short. So even in writing a land acknowledgement, even in using land or access to land, right, we can't continue to make promises that we can't keep to our students. They don't deserve that. So for me, this was really the contention that I had with writing this. And sort of the next step is really starting to think about divestment and relationships and responsible investing for institutions. Here's the truth. And this I can definitively say, because Indigenous people control 80% of the world's biodiversity, steward or shepherd, right? Or have been sort of dynamic in understanding that biodiversity. If we do not take care of the earth in the work that we do, we will not have future generations of students to fill our schools or to fill our classrooms or to believe in the possibility of the future, right? So again, that idea of your institution has the land acknowledgement, but they're not responsibly investing in clean energy or in things that are actually going to serve and protect the earth. I had to apply this to my own work as well, right? I had to start making the Native American Cultural Center a more sustainable place. I have to practice what I preach. And really, without students having access to the earth, who's going to care for it? Who's going to care about it? Earth Day can't be a one-day thing. This is so central to Indigenous people. It has to be every single day. And how do we challenge institutions to invest responsibly and sustainability? So really, without responding critically to climate change, we will lose the lessons that the earth has to teach us. We're losing them right now. We go and we see an exhibit and it's about an endangered animal, right? Or it's about a plant that died off, or it's about plants that ate the indigenous plants that were there already originally. But we don't actually think about the fact that, oh, that's really sad. It is devastating. We are losing knowledge, right? And so often our institutions, our school systems, our higher education institutions, and the research that they conduct, they also are contributing to that. So for me, in my work, I am very lucky to work at an institution that has more than 200 Native students on campus. And the Native student group at the University of South Dakota is called Tioshpaye, which in Lakota, it really sort of represents this concept of your family or your relations. And to me, truly, for student success, our work, the work that we do in DEI, in teaching, in nurturing students, it is entirely centered on our relationships and on the way that we treat each other as good relatives. This is at the very, very center of the work that I love to be a part of, and that I love, and that I know so many of you who love this work and who have been in education appreciate and understand. And so really even thinking about yourself as a role within that network of relations, right? This is very, very inherent to our systems of society, the way that we viewed ourselves. Everybody in the Lakota society had a role, occupied a particular role, had a tioshpaye, had people that cared for them. And so our student group knew this. They chose a name centered on kinship, centered on relations. And those relations include the land, they include the sky, right? They include everything that's around us, that surrounds us. And so for you, even within your own roles that you occupy in your schools, in your institutions, in the work that you do, who is that extended family for you? What is the support system that holds you up, right, over this last difficult year? For us, that support system is what made us survive. That's the resilience of Native people in this country, is that we leaned and depended on one another, right? And our nations now, if you look at our youth and the work that they do, it is so deeply empowering because they have created connections across each other. One of the most beautiful things I think for Native people too is this idea of adaptability. We always adapted. We adapted to our circumstances. We adapted to colonization, settler colonialism. We continue and continue and continue to adapt to our situations. So for you and your work, how are you constantly adapting? How are you finding your extended family or your kinship network in the work that you do? And how do you really empower students to understand that they too are part of a system of relations that is important and valid in the center of their success? And so I want to challenge education systems. You know, I think that all of us, and so many of you in your time, right, you give time to developing relations to your students. But I don't think that everybody within our system is always on the same page, right? It's about research, or in higher education, it's about reaching a certain status, right? Or a fellowship or an award. This concept of westernization, individuality, right, is so antithetical to the way that things used to be, especially for us as Native people. What if we actually held others accountable in the way that we interacted with each other and with students? This is this concept of we are still here, right, of Native people. I can't cover for you all of the histories of Indigenous nations across the United States, but I can share with you, right, that the reason why we survived and the reason why we thrived is because we believed in kinship networks. And we believed in this concept that we were stronger as a collective than we were as an individual, which again, we don't get to see very often. And what if those support systems that we created were truly centered on this concept of Tioshpai, right? An extended family. We looked at success as the betterment of the collective, of all of the people that we cared for. And we see this a lot of times with community-based organizations, right? Or even your cohorts and the experience that you're having this week. Are you better as an individual, or is it better if the cohort, if the collective grows together, right? Comes to conversation together. This is something that I'm constantly trying to think about all of the time. And even in contemporary culture, in sort of modern ways that we think about space and land, right? What is the relationship that Native people have within the networks that you know? Are they included? Are they given a seat at the table? Are they consulted before a land acknowledgement is written? Are they in conversation about environmental efforts that you're doing in your community, right? How will you be a good relative? How will you bring in those perspectives while also honoring and expecting that they will honor the things that you're bringing to the table as well? And so again, in my role, I am in student services, but I view it as relational. I, as the director of Native Student Services, I am working hard to make them feel like I am an extended part of their family. I understand that when a student walks through the door and sees me in this institution, right, that can either feel very overwhelming, that can feel welcoming. What type of a space do I want to occupy? And what type of a person do I want to come across as? Do I want to be open and inviting and welcoming? Or do I want to say, you know, you're on your own, you've got this, you'll be fine? I want to be a system piece within their kinship network. And we're all connected to systems of life. They should be treated as such. All of the photographs that you see today in my presentation are actually from the Black Hills. That's where the center of our creation stories are for Native people in South Dakota. And so I really think about this as I'm connected to those systems of life, right? Because that's the way that things used to be. And every single student on your campus, at your school, in the community-based organization that you work for, they should feel empowered to see themselves within this kinship system. Where is my place? Who are my people? How do I have a relationship that is going to make me grow while also seeing the success of others come to the forefront? And land, to me, while I can't tell you about all Native people, land has always been central to who we are. And if we do not have access to those systems, if our students do not have access to those systems, ultimately we lose. More than ever, our students really need relations right now. And I share this to say that I think that, again, I want to honor the work that you've done. And I want to thank you for everything that you've given to the field. And I know that I am talking to a group of people who have done a tremendous amount of work in survival, in resilience, in not always having the answers, and really affirming that I know that so much of the things that I've talked about today are things that you're already doing. But the reality is that, again, this idea of adaptability, I keep asking my colleagues, asking my kinship networks, what is this new group of students in the fall going to look like, right? All of the Native students, I just received my spreadsheet of all of the students that have registered for the fall. And I'm scrolling through the spreadsheet and I'm looking at their names and I'm thinking to myself, what challenges are going to be different than years prior, right? This group of students, they are the experts in what it is like to experience an education system, much like you are in running a school, teaching, existing within education, right? You are the expert in what it's like to try to do that work during a global pandemic. Our students really are the experts in what it means to live it. I would have students coming to my office asking me questions, and a lot of times I would have to say, you know better than I do. You know better what the answer is here. And I'm here to listen, and I'm here to help you work through it, right? But this group of students that are coming in the fall, they might have lost relatives. They may have had systems that completely crumbled because they weren't able to be sustained during the pandemic. And so our institutions are going to change, and they will have to change, much like these relations, these kinship networks that we've had, right? We will adapt better to the new circumstances that we will be introduced to if we operate as a kinship network, because our students need us to do this work. This past year, I think that in so many ways, we were challenged beyond anything. I had many friends ask me, how's the new role going? And I would say, I don't totally know, because I have not experienced a full academic year at the University of South Dakota as the Director of Native Student Services, not having these challenges come forward. And I think ultimately our responsibility to each other, right, to developing that relationship to land, recentering ourselves, being better relations to one another, is really centered on sometimes the idea that we're better when we're able to lean on one another. So here are some truths. Here's what I can tell you about Native people. We are still here. Despite everything that happened, right? The attempted erasure, removal of land, removal of access to land, we are still here. Our communities have immersion schools and language. Language is centered on land and space and kinship. We've pushed past it, right? We've pushed past it. We are continuing to survive. We are continuing to bring our students into systems that are going to make them successful. And these ideas of kinship and caring, that models decolonization. And it challenges Western ideologies, right, that have not always worked for our students. And so if we really can't acknowledge our complex and beautiful foundations, right, of the way that these things came to be, we cannot move forward as good relations. So this week, as you're challenging yourself to really be in conversation with what are the histories that you learned, right? What are the concepts that you learned around Indigenous people or your own communities? Who were you told that you were supposed to be, and how did you rise above that? How did Native people rise above that, right? How did all of our communities that have been pushed to the brink, that have been marginalized and told that we were not accepted, right? How have they risen above that? That is so, so critically important to acknowledge and to remember. And again, as you move forward, like, what are systems that we protect? So this idea of interacting with land, how do you see it? What is the relationship that you have with it? When you're interacting with others this week, do you listen? Are you really listening to them? Are you honoring their experiences? Or do you try to see those experiences from another angle, right? Interacting with the institution that you work for, do you see it as an institution that can change or that needs to change? And really, in interacting with our country, with our world, do you accept it for what it is? Or do you try to understand different perspectives about other people? And is it modeled around being a good relative to other people? That's the thing that I really hope that you think about as you move forward in appreciating Indigenous epistemologies and appreciating Native people. We always tried to focus on the idea that the collective was always, always better than the individual person. So finally, this idea, right? What work is going to push you forward? For me, it's relationship to land. It's being a Native person. It's seeing my students, right? Seeing my students have a hard day, seeing students succeed or feel and define their own concepts of success. So for you, what do you feel hopeful for in the work that you do? How do we heal as a collective? And how do we really work to acknowledge our foundations in order to be better relations to one another? I really challenge you to think about that and to appreciate that sometimes it really is just going outside. It's taking a deep breath. It's forgiving yourself, right? And thinking about the ways that we can only every single day do a little bit more to be a better relative to one another. So in these final moments of kinship and connecting, it's deeply important for me to say to you that I am available to connect. This is my contact information. I love being in conversation with you about the things that you're thinking about. And I'll tell a very quick story just to kind of wrap up this segment, and we'll move into question and answer. I moved to Vermilion at the end of October, as I had shared with many of you. And I often drive, we are in a very small rural town. I would often drive past this one framing store on Main Street. And in the window was a painting. And I walked past the painting one afternoon and I recognized the man in the painting. And after the person in the store did research and got a hold of the artist and asked, it turns out that the person was my great-great-great-grandfather. And he was sitting in a frame in a painting on the main street of where I now lived. Your relations are powerful. Your kinship networks are powerful. And those things will always turn around and hold you closer, right, in your life. Look out for them and appreciate them. And I thank all of you for being with me today. And I'm really excited for the Q&A portion. So Pilamie, thank you so much.
This was cultural appropriation. This was earth and environmentalism. This was equity, inclusion, and diversity. This is therapy at the top, forgiving yourself. Like, that was a whole meal of of things. I don't really know where to start. First of all, how do I say thank you again? Say it for me again.
You can say Wopula, which means many thank you. Wopula.
Wopula. Golly. Wopula. Tioshpae, that concept of just the family, all of it it's I don't know where to start. I'm gonna start with the map personally. The map really, I saw several things with the map. I saw, first of all, just the disappearance of people that I know also was in conjunction with the migration of Black people out of the South trying to find a place to be, you know, and also I can imagine if you look at that same map, you can also see car dealerships and factories and things that actually have nothing to do with the land, you know, in the same place. So again, just seeing that and recognizing that really the center of the conversation is really, we need to get back to the earth. You know, we need to, in the various ways that we can do that. What do you think? How do you think we can do that? There's one thing of knowing that we should do that, and it is really, how can I do that if I do not feel that I have indigenous heritage, or that, you know, that I am an immigrant, or, you know what I mean? And even as an African American, though I do have, you know, indigenous ancestry, there's some of that I don't know. I know there's Cherokee here and there's some Waccamaw apparently there. But, you know, for those of us who do not necessarily have a specific, you know, tie to the land, how do you think we should get started? What is the best way to help focus?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. I think that so much of the, you know, I was sharing with someone the other day that I often wish that I could go back to school and kind of start, you know, you wish that when you're older, you sort of knew what you wanted to study at another point in time. And I think for me, it's really the idea of environmental justice. Environmental justice is directly linked to the oppression of people of color, of low-income people, of systems that, you know, and I think that we often don't talk about that enough, right? How much environmental justice is linked to many of the things that many of our different communities have experienced or have suffered. Access to clean water, right? Access to
Right.
food systems, food deserts, all of those things are directly correlated with caring for the environment. So I think a lot of times, you know, as I sort of was mentioning before, I grow so frustrated that we have one day or 1 week, right, that centers the earth. This is the week that we need to think about sustainability. When really, I think that it's critically important for us to really think about the way that our carbon footprint impacts the decisions that we make and how those things actually are so directly linked to the work that we do in education. Is your school system, right, responsibly investing? Or is there a recycling program? Or are we teaching students about them caring about the earth and about the way that the sky looks and pollution and what their carbon footprint and impact is as well? So I think that there's sort of that relationship with environmentalism is something that applies to so many of our communities, even if we identify with, right now I'm on somebody else's traditional homelands, but I still care very much about the experiences that they had with the wildlife that was here, right? So I think that my answer would be sort of environmentalism, caring for your community beyond just the people relationships that we have, but also really looking at what your environmental impact is.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. Because even just listening to you, it's in this time when we've not really been able to move about as much, it hasn't been an ability to really take in consideration what is actually around you. What are the birds around you? What wildlife is around you? We get, this has been great for the ability to communicate across and vast spaces, but what is the environment around you and how can you help maintain and uplift that? That really sat with me. You mentioned the importance of centering land in the work you do. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and what it looks like in education?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of times we as educators, and I fall into this too, right? We believe that learning happens in the classroom and that's the only space where we can actually have critical conversations about all of our topics, right? Mathematics, history, science, English, writing. Some of my very favorite days in being a student when I was younger, right, was when our teacher would say, let's go outside. And there wasn't always a lesson plan attached to that, right? But even the physical space of actually being outside in nature. And I mentioned, right, this beautiful concept of like many of our institutions, they write land acknowledgements, but do they actually go out and have a relationship with the land in that process? And so I think that within education, really thinking about different ways that we can start to integrate conversations around those relationships into the curriculum that we do. And I know so often K-12, there's kind of a, this is the subject that you teach, right? Depending on what school system that you're a part of. But how does math play into, and students have different systems of learning. I think that we, and all of us as educators, we are tired trying to figure all of those out, right, for our students. And yet, if you take students outside, you do the math lessons outside in a creative way, right? You're working with small children, you're doing something around addition or subtraction, right? With the trees that are in your area or the grass or whatever it is, right? Will that engage a student in a different way than maybe you hadn't thought about before? Because they come from a home, right? Where maybe they're very focused on the outdoors, or maybe they're very focused on relationship to land. Does that change the way that this student engages with you within the classroom? So I think that for me, right, there's this research aspect of like, I'm really interested in how university endowments have benefited from land because acquisition of land is so intrinsically tied to the creation of higher education. How many of our campuses, right, have bought a new plot of land and then built up a new building, and what trees or birds have they displaced in that process? So for me, sort of thinking about it from the higher ed lens, but I think even in the K-12 space, right, like, what would your relationship with a student look like if you decided to meet with them outside on the picnic bench, right? Or if you decided to do a lesson outside. So I think there are creative ways to engage students. I understand the challenges that can also come with those things, but those are just a few of the things that kind of come to mind in developing those relationships with students.
That's great. It's really, really kind of like decolonizing the idea of indoors versus outdoors, the ideas of institutional learning versus going outside. Something about being outside and amongst the dirt or whatever, not being confined to walls, has created some idea of savagery, for lack of a better word. It's just kind of the language that was used to indicate people who are outdoors versus people who are indoors, and really breaking that down. What are some practical ways schools can create a greater sense of belonging for Indigenous families and students?
Oh, great question. I think that it's really important for educators to remember that we are not, I think that a lot of times when we talk about our histories, right, for Indigenous or Black or, communities, like we talk about them as if they happened a really long time ago. It was not that. Like, we have blood memory, right? We have trauma that we have carried from previous generations because of the experiences that our ancestors had, and because of the oppressive experiences that, like, our communities continue to have because of those systems that were created. And so I think that, like, for educators that are working with Indigenous families and students, to remember and acknowledge that you might be working with parents or grandparents or even great grandparents, right, who are not that far removed from experiencing school in a very, very different way. My mother attended boarding school and had a good experience there, but my father-in-law attended boarding school and had a terrible experience. And so I think that really being able to navigate and understand the experiences that Native people have had within these systems of education, and honor that, there may be a family that is skeptical of you in your classroom because they're not that far removed from classrooms being very oppressive and violent places. And also, I think just really allowing and acknowledging Native students to be themselves and to bring in their cultural identity, avoid stereotypes in classrooms. I was one of those Native kids that went to school and they had the Thanksgiving thing and students were wearing those, wearing the feathers on. I mean, my mom pulled me out of school, right? Like, what else was she supposed to do as a parent? You may have students you work with who have ceremony. Their calendar doesn't operate in the same way as a Western calendar because they have religious or spiritual commitments that they have, right? So really, like, I think trying to meet Native families where they are and have an understanding that just because the academic or school year operates the way that, you've known it to, there are going to be things in their life that may operate on a different calendar because we had different ways of knowing, right? And different systems of faith or identity. So I think that those are some of the things that come to mind for me. And also, I think about Lakota kids, it can be very traditional for a young man to have long hair, right? And so being able to, talking about even simple things as hair, right? Like, that's an important piece of inclusion and belonging too. So those are some of the things that kind of come to mind in creating a sense of belonging for Native families and students.
Yeah, that really speaks to what you things you were saying at the very beginning of even like the idea of forgiving yourself. And also, where is it? I wrote it down. Knowing what you don't know. Sorry. Where is it? Practice forgiveness. Forget everything you thought you knew. That thing. For just like, you might have to be re-educated as an educator. You might need to be re-educated, and even by your students, and being open-minded enough, and thus normalizing vulnerability when you have to do those things. Like, again, it's all here. It's all in it. If you're not taking notes, if you haven't pulled out your little ditty bag, you can take a note, because I promise there's there's nuggets in here. I think we have time for one last question. This came from the chat. On the Trail of Tears, there were multi-ethnic groups impacted. How do we use the concept of Tioshpaye to ensure that we honor and acknowledge various intentional oppressions?
Yes, it's a good question. I think that, and I think that this is a huge, this is not anybody's fault that's on this call, right? But this is like a huge failure of the education system, is that we don't talk about how many of our stories linked with each other, right? There's Native American History Month, right? And there's Pride Month, and there's Black History Month, and right, we separate all of our experiences. And yet there was so much overlapping that happened in the things that were happening to our communities at the same time in the creation of this country, that, creating systems of history that are dynamic and complex and rich, and really actually talking about, like, okay, so this was happening at this time, and so was this, and how, really creating a conversation with your students to say, women were being oppressed in their voting rights. So were Native people. They weren't allowing Native people to vote at the exact same time, right? Like, who's being privileged in those stories? What are the implications of those stories, right? And so I think that, if I could just wave my magic wand and make the education system different, for an example, like Trail of Tears or other things that have really been sort of centered in Native histories, the complexities of all of those dynamics, right, are deeply, deeply important. And so I think just, even being able to, and I know so often we have to follow a certain pathway of how we teach history of those types of things, but if you can identify patterns of identity and have those conversations with your students about, what did this mean for this particular group of people, and what did it mean for this particular group of people, and how were they related to each other? I think that can start to have a really powerful sort of conversation and networking across kinship, right? And across experiences that I think could be really powerful for students to have a better understanding.
That's beautiful. There was one more. You have time. I think you have time. The beginning of the question is, how can someone find out more about indigenous transitional in my community? And I think you can really just do research on that. But this, how can I reach out to them, I think is a very important question, because I think one should be sensitive to an outsider, you being an outsider coming in. Can you speak to that very quickly?
Absolutely. So I think that one of the ways that can be really powerful is that many of our tribal communities, especially the federally recognized and state, typically, they will have an education office. A lot of times they're focused on higher education or K-12 specifically, but even just reaching out to that coordinator or the person that the director of that space and saying, what resources do you have available for educators, is one way that you can get connected to people that are within the tribal communities. So that would be my recommendation.
Fantastic. And right on time. Wopila. I'm sure I might have put the wrong emphasis on the word, but I'm just very thankful and grateful for this time just to speak with you. I know that everyone out here has, please light up the chat. Let us know how you feel about this. This has been a very, very inspiring lecture, if I must say. I hate to call it a lecture because it sounds so academic, but I also felt lectured. I also felt like, Daniel, do you know what birds are around here? Are you paying attention to the land? Knowing that the Lenape people is not enough. Get into it. So thank you. Thank you for both the education and also the inspiration to do more. I think a lot was gained for everyone. So
thank you, Daniel. Everyone have a great day.
Hey, you too. Take care.